They changed the world, broke boundaries, and reshaped history. From powerful leaders to brilliant thinkers, many of history's most celebrated figures had skeletons in their closets. We're talking racism, sexual harassment, ruthless killings, messing with psychedelics, and a whole lot more. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 historical figures with dark secrets they hoped would stay buried forever. 25. Christopher Columbus. Sure, Columbus is often celebrated for his Atlantic voyages and for opening the door to European exploration. But there's a darker side to his story that often gets ignored. Let's start with what we all know. Columbus didn't discover America. The Chinese likely beat him there, the Vikings definitely did, and of course indigenous peoples had been living there for thousands of years. His real legacy was uniting the old world and the new, but not entirely in a good way. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, the Arawak people welcomed him with hospitality, but he responded with violence. He kidnapped them to get information about gold, tortured many, and enslaved even more. Basically, initiating the transatlantic slave trade. Promising riches to Spain, he unleashed a nightmare that led to the destruction of entire communities. According to Bartolomé de las Casas, over 3 million people died because of Columbus's cruelty. That's one hell of a gruesome conquest. A legacy that deserves to be remembered. 24. Albert Einstein. You know, when people mention Albert Einstein, I bet you think of the groundbreaking theories, brilliant equations, and maybe even that famous photo of him sticking his tongue out. Although Einstein is best known for breakthroughs in physics, he also had a complicated personal life that revealed a side he rarely shared. His marriage to Mileva Maric, a fellow physicist and mother of his 2 sons, fell apart, partly because of Einstein's reported infidelities. Their relationship was pretty tense. He even wrote up a list of strict rules for Mileva to follow just to keep things together. Eventually, they divorced. And guess what? He got married to his cousin Elsa, but he didn't exactly settle down. And that's not all. His relationship with his kids, especially his son Edward, who faced schizophrenia, was terribly strained. So while Einstein's genius is clear, his personal choices weren't really smart. 23. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin, the iconic silent film star, was known for his relationships with much younger women. At 29, he married 16-year-old Mildred Harris because she was pregnant with his child. Although Mildred landed some acting roles thanks to Chaplin, he was unsupportive and told her that she had no talent. In 1924, he got Leda Gray, another 16-year-old actress from the Gold Rush, pregnant. They married but divorced 3 years later in a scandal that rocked Hollywood. Leda accused Chaplin of abuse in a detailed 50-page statement and claimed he pressured her into getting an abortion. After another failed marriage to 22-year-old Paulette Goddard, Chaplin eventually married Una O'Neill, who was just 18 while he was in his 50s. 22. Wright Brothers. Although the Wright brothers are celebrated as aviation pioneers, their obsession with lawsuits actually held back the industry for years. In 1903, Orville and Wilbur successfully made the first flight. But when other inventors tried to get in on the action, the brothers filed patents not just for their technology, but also for the basic principles of flight. This didn't sit well with other innovators, who argued that patents should only apply to specific machines, not the science behind flying. Between 1907 and 1917, the Wrights found themselves tangled in countless lawsuits, which pretty much trapped the American aviation scene at a standstill. In fact, during World War I, American pilots had to fly European planes because there weren't any American models ready for military service. It wasn't until after the war that Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, suggested a patent pool. This would allow airplane makers to share their technologies for a small fee, paving the way for innovation. 21. Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, the famous English writer and social critic, is celebrated for his colorful characters and sharp depictions of Victorian society. But behind the scenes, he had a complicated and often bitter relationship with the women in his life. After his father was imprisoned, Dickens was pulled from school and forced to work in a factory, a move he blamed on his mother. In his marriage to Catherine Hogarth, he didn't trust her to handle tasks, often following her to ensure she ran errands correctly. When he began an affair with 18-year-old actress Ellen Ternan, he even tried to bribe doctors to label Catherine as mentally ill to justify a divorce. That's a weird way to blow the cash he made from those books we're all forced to read. 20. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, revolutionized our understanding of the human mind with his theories on the unconscious, dreams, and sexuality. But let's be real. His life was a bit of a mixed bag. For starters, Freud experimented with cocaine and promoted it in the late 19th century as a miracle drug. He even prescribed it to patients, which didn't end well for some who ended up addicted. But that's not all. His approach to psychoanalysis often raised eyebrows, as he had a knack for viewing nearly every behavior through the lens of repressed sexuality, and suggested that trauma was more about fantasies than real experiences. Sure, Freud had some groundbreaking ideas, but his methods and biases sparked several debates. I mean, who really wants to see him hawking his miracle drug to a bunch of bored teens? 19. Mother Teresa. When you hear Mother Teresa, three things that probably come to mind are compassion, selflessness, and her iconic blue and white sari. Mother Teresa, perhaps the most iconic female figure in the Catholic Church, built a global legacy through her missionaries of charity. She grew her missionaries of charity from a small group into a massive network of over 5,600 nuns and tons of volunteers. They set up schools and clinics, and even a leper colony called Shantinagar in India. But here's where it gets sticky. Lots of volunteers, including undercover reporter Hemingway Gonzalez, said her hospices often skipped basic medical protocols. I'm talking reused needles and questionable sanitation practices, like washing soiled clothes next to silverware. The report claims volunteers were so blinded by the myth of Mother Teresa and their own philanthropy that they overlooked the inhumane treatment of patients. In addition to criticism of her own medical care, Mother Teresa associated with questionable figures like Robert Maxwell and Charles Keating, accepting donations without regard for their sources. 18. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, widely recognized as a founding father and the author of the Declaration of Independence, had a personal life that starkly contradicted the ideals he so passionately promoted. He spoke eloquently about liberty and justice, yet kept over 600 slaves. One of those enslaved was Sally Hemings, a mixed-race woman who was also Jefferson's legal property. Their relationship likely spanned many years, and he fathered several children with her. Sally, who is the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife Martha, had little say in their relationship due to her status as a slave. Even though Jefferson recognized the moral issues surrounding slavery, he even wrote condemning it, he continued to profit from and uphold the institution. 17. Thomas Edison. Speaking of Thomases, while Thomas Edison is credited with some groundbreaking inventions, he also had a reputation as a bully who felt threatened by the success of others and often took credit for ideas that weren't his own. In 1894, Nikola Tesla arrived in America to work with Edison, but instead of collaborating, he faced harassment. Edison dismissed Tesla's idea for an alternating current motor as too dangerous. Then he bribed him to improve Edison's existing technologies with a promise of $50,000. After Tesla succeeded, Edison jokingly told him, "When you become a full-fledged American, you'll appreciate an American joke." Meanwhile, George Westinghouse had acquired Tesla's alternating current patent, prompting Edison to feel threatened. He launched a smear campaign, even electrocuting animals to discredit Tesla's technology while supporting the development of the electric chair using Tesla's designs. Come on, that's really petty. And real quick, guys, if you're enjoying this video and you want to help me out, please give it a like and comment down below. I know us YouTubers say it a lot, but it seriously helps the algorithm. I mean it. Thank you so much. 16. Steve Jobs. It's finally time to talk about the man who put the iPhone in our hands, but ghosted when it came to fatherhood. In her memoir, Small Fry, Lisa Brennan Jobs, daughter of Steve Jobs, paints a picture of her father as incredibly cruel. Initially, Jobs denied he was Lisa's father and refused to pay child support. When the courts finally mandated that he pay, he made sure to finalize all the paperwork before Apple went public, so it looked like he was worth much less than he actually was. Jobs' meanness extended into the business world too. He was notorious for firing employees without cause, asking invasive questions during interviews, and refusing to give his closest team members fair compensation or stock options at Apple. 15. Henry Ford. While Henry Ford is often celebrated for revolutionizing transportation with the Model T, he was also notorious for his anti-Semitic views. Ford believed that Jewish people were to blame for much of the world's problems. In 1918, he purchased the Dearborn Independent, his local newspaper, and started publishing a series of articles claiming that Jewish people were conspiring to undermine America. This series ran for 91 issues and was later compiled into a 4-volume book titled The International Jew, which he distributed over 500,000 copies. In 1938, Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Adolf Hitler, a prestigious award for foreigners. Additionally, he created the Ford Sociological Department, employing over 200 people to monitor workers and ensure that they adhered to his strict personal standards. 14. Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, celebrated for his nonviolent resistance and role in India's independence, is often seen as a beacon of peace and morality. But later in life, this round glasses-wearing old guy got a bit strange, conducting some odd experiments on celibacy by sleeping next to young women, including his teenage grandniece, just to test his self-control. This behavior raised eyebrows, even among his followers, and has been widely criticized as inappropriate. And if you think that wasn't bad enough, Gandhi also held some pretty discriminatory views during his time in South Africa, where he expressed derogatory opinions about black Africans. And as someone who advocates for unity and equality, that's a pretty difficult stain to erase. 13. J. Edgar Hoover. This character is definitely a different breed than most people on this list. This is J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI for almost 50 years, from 1924 until 1972. While he's credited with turning the FBI into a crime-fighting powerhouse, his methods were often pretty shady. Hoover kept extensive secret files on public figures, using their personal info to manipulate everyone, from politicians to activists and even presidents. He was certainly a racist, and his obsession with surveillance hit a peak during the civil rights movement, with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. in his sights. Through programs like COINTELPRO, he approved tactics like spying and psychological warfare against anyone he saw as a threat to American security. Ironically, he had his own secrets. With rumors swirling about a hidden personal life he worked hard to keep under wraps. 12. Henry VIII of England. Forget your average monarch. Henry VIII of England's reign was a wild ride filled with ambition, scandal, and a quest for legacy. Starting off as a young king deeply rooted in Catholicism, Henry found himself in a bind when his first wife Catherine of Aragon couldn't give him a male heir. So he requested an annulment, but when the Pope said no, Henry took matters into his own hands. He broke away from the Catholic Church, created the Church of England, and crowned himself its head. But his personal life was even more dramatic. Out of 6 wives, he executed 2, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, on charges of treason and adultery. By the end of his reign, Henry was a full-blown tyrant. But at least Henry finally lived to see his son, which he called his most noble and most precious jewel. 11. President Andrew Jackson. Like Andrew Jackson, the 7th US president was famous for his populist approach on his role in expanding democracy in America. But of course, his legacy isn't without serious blemishes, especially when it comes to his policies towards Native Americans. A strong proponent of westward expansion, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forced thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The most notorious outcome was the Trail of Tears, a heartbreaking march that saw countless Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole people endure starvation and disease along the way. While Jackson argued that these policies were essential for progress, they resulted in unimaginable suffering and loss of life. 10. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th US president and a champion of progressive reform, is often remembered for his leadership during World War I and his efforts to create the League of Nations. During his presidency, Wilson took steps to resegregate the federal government. After some progress during Reconstruction, many government agencies had become desegregated. But in 1913, Wilson reinstated segregation in departments like the Postal Service and the US Treasury. Wilson also showed support for the KKK, describing it in his book, A History of the American People, as a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Wow. Next level logic right there, because nothing says freedom of speech like a good old dose of violence. 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, the legendary Mongol leader, built one of the largest empires in history through sheer ambition. In the early 13th century, he united the Mongolian tribes and set off on campaigns that expanded Mongol rule across vast areas of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. However, his methods were brutal. Entire cities were destroyed and millions lost their lives. By employing tactics meant to intimidate and overpower, Khan effectively controlled a massive territory and kept his enemies at bay. While his reign led to a period of stability and boosted trade along the Silk Road, it came with an enormous human cost. Estimates of the death toll from his conquests range in the tens of millions, with historians highlighting his use of psychological warfare. 8. P.T. Barnum. This is probably the most manipulative person on this countdown. P.T. Barnum, the showman behind The Greatest Show on Earth, built his fame by exploiting and tricking the public. With his famous saying, "There's a sucker born every minute," Barnum used some pretty shady tactics to pull in crowds, from fake exhibits to outright scams. One of his most notorious attractions was Joyce Heth, an enslaved woman he claimed was the 161-year-old nurse of George Washington. He showcased her as a living curiosity, and even held a public autopsy after her death for paying spectators. Barnum also peddled hoaxes like the Fiji mermaid, which was really just a monkey's torso stitched to a fish's tail. In a nutshell, he was a master manipulator and con artist who turned those skills into a successful career. 7. King Edward VII. King Edward VII of England ruled in the early 20th century, doing all the typical things you'd expect from a monarch: settling disputes, signing treaties, and so on. But what really set him apart were his wild, unkingly escapades in his spare time. After falling out with his mother, Queen Victoria, over claims he caused his father's death, Edward decided to live life to the fullest. Free from royal scrutiny, he drove into a series of outrageous sexual adventures that lasted until he ascended the throne. His exploits included wife-swapping among the elite, bathing in champagne with prostitutes, and even commissioning a unique piece of furniture. Being a rather large man, Edward found traditional sex too taxing, so he had an ornate sex chair created, designed to allow him to pleasure two partners at once. 6. H.G. Wells. When we hear the name H.G. Wells, we often think of the brilliant author behind classics like The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. It's easy to assume he was just another shy nerd. But in reality, Wells had a far more adventurous love life than most of us could ever imagine. After a pretty dull childhood in 19th century England, he decided to embrace life and all its pleasures. Between dreaming up alien invasions and invisible men, he built an impressive collection of sexual escapades, which he meticulously recorded in a journal. Wells' erotic adventures kept going right up until his death. 5. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is widely recognized as the 18th President of the United States and a key figure in the Civil War. He worked closely with Abraham Lincoln, leading the Union Army to victory over the Confederacy and playing a significant role in ending slavery in the U.S. His bravery made him a hero to millions. While Grant opposed slavery and fought to end it, he also held deeply to racist beliefs. After the Civil War, instead of addressing racial tensions, he proposed a radical plan to relocate all Black Americans to an isolated island. Specifically, he suggested shipping around 4 million formerly enslaved people to the Caribbean island of Santo Domingo in exchange for $1.5 million. 4. Salvador Dalí. Salvador Dalí wasn't just known for his surreal, mind-bending art, he was also a walking spectacle. Dalí lived for shock value. His over-the-top personality was part self-promotion, part genuine weirdness. But his personal life was just as wild. Dalí's marriage to Gala, who was 10 years older, was intense and open, with both having affairs. Gala had a notably strong sex drive and engaged in numerous extramarital affairs throughout her life, including with her former husband, Paul Éluard. Interestingly, Dalí encouraged these liaisons, as he practiced candorlism, deriving pleasure from the idea of his partner being with other men. There were rumors of Dalí's creepy behavior around young women, making some in his circle uneasy. His eccentricity showed up in his art too, with disturbing themes of sex, decay, and religious imagery. 3. Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, the legendary writer behind The Old Man and the Sea and A Farewell to Arms, lived a life that was as intense as his novels. Beneath his tough, macho image, Hemingway battled severe alcoholism, which fueled rocky relationships and took a toll on his mental health. His marriages were messy, and his drinking only made things worse with his family and friends. As he got older, his struggles with alcohol and depression deepened, leading to him taking his own life in 1961. His writings and his life were closely connected, with his stories often reflecting his battles with love, masculinity, and mortality. 2. Oscar Wilde. Now, this guy is the only one on the list whose secret has to do with the abuse he faced. Oscar Wilde, the famous playwright and poet, became a target of Victorian England's strict moral codes when he was prosecuted for being gay. Known for his sharp wit and flamboyant style, Wilde was a sensation. But his romance with Lord Alfred Douglas led to a huge scandal. In 1895, he was charged with gross indecency for his homosexual relationships, which were illegal back then. Despite his fame, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, which left him physically drained and broke. Wilde's trial and imprisonment highlight the harsh realities of being open in a repressive society, where personal freedoms were often denied. His story sheds light on the prejudice against LGBTQ+ people in the 19th century and hints at the slow march toward equality that would come later. 1. Alexander Graham Bell. Most grade school kids know who Alexander Graham Bell is. He's the genius inventor behind the telephone, a groundbreaking invention that connected people in ways previously thought impossible. Bell is often celebrated as a hero of communication and social interaction. However, it's pretty ironic that he was also a staunch anti-deaf activist. Bell was a proponent of eugenics, believing that people with disabilities were defective and should not be allowed to contaminate the human gene pool. Bell pushed to ban sign language, fired deaf teachers, and wanted to outlaw marriages between deaf people. Worst of all, he backed the idea of sterilizing deaf people, hoping to erase deaf culture and make everyone fit into a world that didn't want to adapt. Was he so pissed that deaf people couldn't use his telephone or something? Maybe. So now's the time I usually point you to one of our other videos in this end screen here. However, I do have some exciting news. I just launched a new channel called Dark Roast Detectives where I deep dive into true crime stories. So if you or anyone you know is a fan of true crime, it would mean a lot. The videos, true crime video, please don't be a fan of true crime. Don't do crimes, kids. That's PSA. If you like watching videos about true crime, please check it out here. It'll really help me a lot. Seriously, don't do crimes. I really hope you're not a fan of crimes. Oh no.